afternoon and welcome to CMC. So founded in 1976 by 13 visionary women leaders, CMC's mission is to connect people and ideas through community conversation. And to carry out its mission, CMC explores public policy issues, current events, and lessons in leadership every Wednesday. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone, so thanks for being with us. I'm Kristen Easterday. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, and I'm a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. Thank you for that shout out. I would like to officially welcome you to CMC's annual Charles Y. and Frances N. Lazarus Revisiting Columbus History Forum, and thank you to today's forum sponsor, Moody Nolan. Thank you all. Today's live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And let's thank all of our supporting, all those who are supporting today's sponsors. Thank you. All right, let's get into it. Many American cities have earned unfortunate reputations for tearing down historic structures once they are deemed to be standing in the way of progress. Today's speakers, however, have dedicated their careers to reverse this trend, both in Columbus and elsewhere, by saving historic buildings and repurposing them for new uses. Among their success stories here in Columbus are restoring the Lincoln Theater and the brand new East Market. And if you haven't been, which I have not yet, I hate to say, we're all supposed to go. So let's welcome today's speakers, Brad DeHays, founder of Connect Real Estate, Charissa W. Durst, President and Principal Historic Architect of Hardlines Design Company, Rebecca Kemper, the new CEO of Columbus Landmarks, and our host, David Meleca, Director of Classical Architecture for Moody Nolan. You can learn more about today's speakers in the forum flyer. So David, we look forward to today's conversation.
Hello, everyone. All right, we're going to jump right into this. Are you ready? Okay. Probably a softball, but why historic preservation? Why do we want to save buildings, old buildings? And this is an open question. So we'll start at the end. Becca?
I started with me? All right. Well, and I think in the question, it's important to think about that component of the building, right? Because it is the building, but it's also the stories of the building. It's the stories around it. What makes these places important is that we have embodied histories in them. That we have memories, our own memories, the stories we've heard from our family and friends about being in these places. And that's what makes it important. That we have a cultural touchstone that we can refer to as we continue on in the city. And that tells us and informs us a little bit about maybe where the city can go. So that's why I'm really passionate about historic preservation.
Charissa?
Well, honestly, some of those old buildings just look really cool. They've got really nice details that you just can't get a craftsman to recreate anymore. But, you know, speaking about embodiment, it's like the amount of energy and materials it took to get that building built. It always seems to me it's such a shame to knock it down and stick it in a landfill. Although I did have an employee once who was a geography major who said we should do this more often just so that we create some topography in Columbus. But I don't think that's really the best use of buildings. But yes, I think a lot of people, I feel, would rather work and live in a nicely rehabbed historic building with interesting details than to just move into a new build.
So typically, the historic buildings are on the best real estate. So as a developer, I think it's one of the things to where when we're looking at where to put our time and our investment, we look to put them, you know, in the best geographic location with regards to land. But then it takes it a step further, and you have, we spend a lot of time in our new builds trying to figure out how to make a building cool, how to make it attractive, how to give it character. We have some great architecture firms in the room. We usually go to experts to figure that out. With historic buildings, it kind of tells us a story on the front end, and we actually just have to highlight the work that someone else did a long time ago. So there are components of it that make it attractive that actually are less work for us, as long as we're able to preserve them.
So what do you think one of the biggest losses in Columbus as far as historic buildings? I mean, what would what do you point at as being one of the missing teeth, I call them? Brad, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So I say about 10 years ago, I used to look at the National Register of Historic Places and look at the images online of the buildings. And every time I look through it, I come up to the Peruna drug manufacturing building. It was on Rich Street. And it had, kind of, an ornate arches of marble with a brick structure. And it canvassed the entire corner. So it's one of those you see in other major cities around the United States where a building looks like it just eats up an entire corner with all of this detail. And then you look down and you see it was demolished in 1973, and then you're like, bummer. But and you look at what's there now, it's a little one-story structure in a parking lot. So that I keep falling on that building, but that's one I always keep coming back to.
One that I remember just driving down Broad Street, and I don't remember the name of the house, but there was this white brick mansion with turrets. And one day I drove by and it was gone, and all that was left is the garage standing on the alley. And I just remember every day when I drove by that, it was like, that would make such a cool office. One day I need to buy this building and just renovate it. And then one day it was disappeared. So, and I guess there used to be a lot of mansions on Broad Street that one by one have disappeared.
Well, I'm here representing Columbus Landmarks, so, Union Station was a critical moment in terms of a loss to the city and its history. And I think it's important to remember that really sort of forged a lot of our efforts here in the city. On a personal note, there was a building in Grandview Heights, and it was a mid-1900s structure, building of faith, converted into a veterinary hospital. So this is kind of an example of a small building that actually had a lot of meaning that probably a lot of people didn't know. It was bulldozed during the pandemic. But what a lot of people didn't know is that veterinary clinic was the Apple Veterinary Clinic. It was one of the first women to go through the veterinary school at OSU. And it was one of those small things where we have such a critical group of women that know that history. And it was lost.
My first dog went to that vet.
Right. So what's funny is people in the know really had an issue with that building disappearing, right? So we have a wide spectrum of buildings that mean so much to people, and it's important to know these stories, right? And to feel that loss.
Yeah. I always say about buildings, if, and how I measure the quality of them or how they add to the fabric, is if they were gone, would I miss them? If that building specifically was not there and something was in its place, would I miss that building? And I find a lot of the newer stuff, or even some of the mid-century stuff, that it really is inconsequential, I think, artistically. But getting into renovating buildings, and Brad, you just finished are working on a major renovation of the trolley building, or trolley district now, right? Tough thing to do. One of the things we're seeing a lot is these are going on the historic registry to try to get tax credits for them. Can you talk a little bit maybe about how did you approach that project and historic preservation and getting on the registry with that?
So that project, what's amazing is when we named it the Trolley District, we actually had to call the city to find out, how do you name a district? And they said, I have no idea. And then I got a call back, they said, we think you just name it. And it felt incredibly odd, to say, oh, we're just gonna call it a district. But when we started looking at it, it's 5 buildings, 3.5 acres, and we're working with Schooley Caldwell on the apartment complex across the street. And as we started looking at, okay, are we tax credit eligible? It was in a historic district. So it was a contributing structure in a historic district that someone else had already done the work to make it eligible. So it qualified. But there's 2 types of historic tax credits. You have the federal, which you get as long as you're qualified, and then the state is a competitive process. And the criteria are the same, they're redundant, but at the same time as you have to go through one of those 2 rounds. And we lost the first time through, and then because we just didn't score enough. And Columbus's success has hurt us in this area in the state tax credit program because there's census tract data that that it puts us behind Cincinnati and behind Cleveland because we've been successful over the last decade. And what happened there was I had to actually buy the land across the street to be able to have enough project leverage to do the tax credits. And all this took time. It took an incredible amount of time. And the complexities of tax credits beyond that and other programs, I mean, it could take up this whole hour, so I'll stop there. But it's something to where once you lock them in, there's not a lot of flexibility. So you take a project that just because of the unknown components of it as you get into working on it, things falling down, things not structurally stable that everyone thought were, measurements, for as-built not being the same as everyone thought, all these issues that come up throughout the construction process. And then you have an investor that bought tax credits that is on the national level, because usually it's a national bank, and they're not very fluid, they're not flexible. So you have all these things changing, and it's very difficult to balance it. But we've been able to do it on a few very difficult projects. It has not been easy, but at the same time, as once you're in, you just keep you keep eating, So we've been able to get to the finish line on a couple good ones. So.
All right, Charissa, so tax credits, when you do go for tax credit, the criterias that they put on the project can be overwhelming. So can you talk a little bit about that?
It can be, but they are designed to basically preserve what is important about the building, its features. I remember being told that if you have to destroy too many of the historic features in order to get your project to work, it's probably the wrong use for the building. Before I even get into it, I will meet with the owner and say, what are you trying to do with the building? So up in Mount Vernon, they had a theater. They were trying to keep it a theater. I was like, okay. Because if they were going to do a tax credit project trying to fill that theater with apartments, I'd probably say that's not going to work. The other thing we have advantage of is we're Ohio, and our historic preservation office is incredibly competent. So once they bless your project, it goes to the Park Service, it's almost just rubber stamped. Whereas some states aren't so lucky, like their state may bless it, but then it goes through all sorts of delays at the Park Service, which has a lot of questions. So I always tell people who are thinking about doing tax credit projects, do it now before our staff at Chabot retire.
Yeah.
And before this one guy at the Park Service who handles, the upper half of the country retires as well. Like, they're incredibly good, they get the project through, do it now.
So Becca, as the new CEO of Landmarks, probably twofold. What do you see as the future of Landmarks, and how are you moving Landmarks? And then the second thing is, what are you doing to help projects like the trolley district and other historic preservation projects? What is Landmarks going to do for us?
No, thank you. Those are very good questions. So I think in terms of discussing these projects, one of the critical component that Columbus Landmarks, how we can help, is that we have a historic preservation director, Susan Keeney, who's sort of an expert in all things in terms of, what are the regulations, how to move forward in terms of projects. We have a lot of expertise on the ground in terms of documentation and assisting with all those components for storing that history. And this is a really critical component when it comes to preservation, is adaptive reuse, making sure that we know, and to your point, that these spaces have an appropriate use moving in the future. This is the way that buildings stay up, that they are used, they're occupied, and they remain meaningful to the community. And so my role here as CEO is really continuing pushing that forward, maintaining our expertise and our connection throughout the community for individuals that are wanting to undertake this challenging work and go through all of those hurdles to make sure that we have a thriving and vibrant urban fabric here in Columbus. One of the other continuing challenges within Columbus, as it is for the rest of the nation, is who can do this work in terms of who can build these structures. Trades, we have a workforce development shortage that is severe. We have right now a bipartisan federal legislation to move infrastructure funding forward. That's wonderful. But when you look at the numbers in terms of how many people need to be brought into construction, the trades, architecture, and structural engineering, it's about the same number of people that are going to be exiting in the next 15 years. it needs to be double. It's a major challenge. And so some of the things that Columbus Landmarks has started to do, and I'm really excited to forward in this role, is that we're working with programs like Fort Hayes to develop the next generation of skilled craftsmen, that we're introducing young individuals to this with Columbus, and we're working side by side with Columbus Public Schools. We're really excited about that work. We're excited about working with individuals that are passionate about how do we use technology right now to translate and transmit expert knowledge from craftsmen who are exiting and retiring, so that it's a way to leverage that knowledge out. So those are sort of the new frontiers of Columbus Landmarks, is doing the work that we're doing, empowering and partnering, but also really looking to the future of who are going to be in these spaces and doing this work in the future.
Yeah, one of the things I want to mention, and I'm thankful that Columbus Landmarks, really advocated for a project we were doing in a historic district. So trying to fit in with the fabric, they came out and actually gave us a stamp of approval, which helped move through the process. So yes, thank you for that. So again, I guess going to Brad, let's talk a little bit more about these projects and how difficult they are, and dealing with specifically Columbus. What do you see as the good thing the city's doing towards moving these projects ahead, and what are the things that are negative or being resistive to these projects?
So with our projects, a few of our larger ones, we've had the benefit of the city leadership really being interested and staying involved, and that helps a lot. Columbus Landmarks, they're 10 most endangered buildings. That's always a big deal every year, because then if you're doing one of the buildings that's on that list, you can point right to it and say, this is important. This is important to people. It's important to the community. And our leaders have gotten that. And it really, when you're going through the drudge of trying to plan a project like of this magnitude, you really want to make sure that as a developer, sometimes you have to go and obtain zoning that people don't want. Sometimes you have to go and stand up in front of the firing squad, we say, and try to obtain things like abatements and things like that. But when the city leadership is on board, it really helps. And Municipal Light Plant, obviously it was a city-owned building, they were on board. The Trolley District, they were on board, genuinely interested. And then that bleeds down through the administration, bleeds down into code enforcement and plans examination. It's tough to have plans examiners review architectural drawings on a building when you're doing an adaptive reuse. And one of the big differences I think will be part of the discussion going forward is going to be, a historic building. It is a lot easier to get the state on board and the state reviewers on board and everybody on board if your paths of egress stay exactly the same. If there's a lot of unique architecture that you're just preserving. But adaptive reuse is taking a historic building on a historic site that had a historic use, and you're adapting the egress paths. Then you have to update the fire system, fire suppression systems, all these things that buildings didn't have, and it's very difficult for a plans examiner to review it. So one of the things that really helps is for the chief building official to be aware that the project's going on, because these lags in time kill deals. It's hard to get tenants. A lot of times our big tenants in town, they want to plan their own space in a new building. That's just part of the reality for an office tenant. When in fact some of the most unique buildings on the best real estate are historic structures. So, I think they're doing a good job. They're just tough. There's not enough plans examiners that really understand historic buildings and that are kind of able to kind of get out of the path of reviewing new build projects. And then, the difference from the plans examiner down to the inspector. There's a lot of this. A lot of that doesn't help us. And when this happens and it goes shuffled to the back of the file, everybody comes to me for answers, and I have no answers. And so I think we should, honestly, and it's self-serving, but I think it's necessary, is I think historic buildings that are tax credit deals should get preferential treatment for adjudication orders, which are, when the plans reviewer has issues with what was submitted by the architecture firm. when there are amendments and changes to the construction drawings because of an unknown feature. I think putting us at the bottom of the file stack because the plans examiner's busy, you lose tenants, and these are critical projects that have national investors. And national investors, they don't care. They don't care about your timeline. They don't care about your little market. They're interested, but they have to maintain their returns. So at the end of the day, I think if that was a known piece, we've had success because, we just push, but at the same time as other developers, I think, would have a more difficult time.
Charissa, so same question. I mean, from an architect's perspective, what do you think?
Well, I guess I was lucky that for the Lincoln Theater, we were working pretty much with the city, and it was the mayor's pet project. So I think from the top down, everybody got the squeeze, make sure this project gets through. And I think the major difficulty, we had to close an alley and reroute some water. And, talking to the water department, they just flat out said, our records aren't very complete. The urban legend is that somebody who had been there for a long time had all these drawings in his car, and when he retired, the drawings just went with him. So there's this big blank. So I was like, well, how do we know? And they just said, well, we just shut it off and see who calls to complain, and then we know. Like, really? And and then, well, hope nobody from Columbia Gas is here, but it seems like every time we have gas company connections, it always gets held up because they work on their own timeline and nobody can tell them to go any faster.
Want to kind of move into a different question or a different realm of this. We talked a little bit about, at our table, about the fabric of Columbus and how streets and widths of streets and one-way streets and how they affect preservation and keeping and just how a downtown functions. Becca, do you want to talk a little bit about what you saw in the 50s, or know about the 50s and 60s that changed and transformed, say, Columbus specifically?
Sure. And I think it is a really important question to think about traffic flows around these structures, right? We can't really appreciate them if we're zooming by. It's harder to have a connection if we're not allowing for pedestrian ways to feel comfortable or even bicycle ways to feel comfortable, right? And so here and in many cities across the nation during that time period, it was not just car centricity, but also just ways of being concerned about evacuating cities and quickly and making one-way streets and making those ones where you can get out. Cold War era concerns as well. And it's unfortunate. I mean, in what's been wonderful to see within the city is sort of a re-examining of places that were one-way and thinking of creatively about smart street connections, also having bump outs, things that slow traffic down. It's important for the vibrancy of city that we maintain some leisurely activity around these spaces too, right? And that it's comfortable, that we can walk places, that we can have that connection. So it's to maintain that importance and to actually have that cultural touchstone, you need to be able to get to it and to get out of the car too. And it's important too as we move to an era where we really do understand about environmental sustainability. The most green building is one that's still standing. About half of our landfill waste is construction waste, right? Yep. So if we're not valuing these cities because we can't have connection to them, in a personal connection, walking up to them, we might knock them down. And not only is that kind of wasteful from a emission standpoint of how we're traveling, but it's also problematic in terms of our built structure and how we're maintaining that and how we're living.
And I know we talked a little bit about, traffic engineers. I mean, their goal is to get people in and out of places quickly, especially downtowns. Brad, do you want to talk a little about how that affects retail? I know probably, and retail specifically.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a Midwesterner, and being a Midwesterner, I love my car, and I like driving places. And I like getting, I coach kids sports. I like getting home quick after work. But if you think about it, we've been spoiled for so long here. Bob Weiler told me, he's like, you can get anywhere in the 270 outer belt in 25 minutes. He's like, do we really have, an issue with traffic? And, when we go and we start doing multi-lane one-ways, and we make it 35 mile an hour, or in some cases 45 mile an hour, you are killing all retail along that corridor. Because Destination retail, out parcel retail at exits, it can thrive and survive because you know why you're going there. You know why you're going to Wendy's. You know why you're going to a gas station. But when you're talking about what we consider transient retail, which is on a sidewalk that maybe you're not going to park right in front of it and be able to get in, we need a little bit of congestion. So like when we go to try to put a retail business in, like we have a Grandview Cafe, which actually it's not even in Grandview, it's in Columbus, but it's 25 mile per hour and it's congested. But what it does is it allows people to actually look and see what's going on. It creates this vibrancy of where cars are not whizzing by, so people can comfortably walk on the sidewalk, comfortably find a place to park without getting panicked. And for us, we want to see that downtown. And I think, if that could happen, then people actually might make the decision, okay, it's 5 o'clock. Well, you know what? I actually don't have to be home till 6. I'm going to avoid the rush hour, and I'm going to go to the local coffee shop again, or I'm going to go to the local bar for happy hour, or I'm going to go, visit somewhere to get some kind of merchandise, by a local shop. I think that's really critical. As we grow, we kind of need to slow down, in my opinion, especially downtown, because no matter what, we are so far ahead of everyone else with regards to ease and logistics that I think if we start to embrace what may for a short amount of time be uncomfortable, I think our retail businesses will thrive. I think people will want to live more downtown because once you have retail, more residential comes around it, more offices come back. But it's a shift that has to, everybody has to embrace it.
Right. Now, me and our family live downtown, and, the pandemic has kind of put a squash on a lot of traffic. I mean, we would normally look out our windows and we'd see parking lots that are full. I would say that they're 20% what they used to be, and I think we are definitely going to see a change in how people work, that there's going to be less people coming into offices on a daily basis. Again, I think that's another thing that's going to overlay, that's going to affect how retail can and will develop. But, for a positive aspect of that, there is less congestion downtown right now. There's more opportunity for living, so more opportunities for new businesses to open up and become, a vibrant part of the downtown. I wanted to talk a little bit, also ask a question about, what you see are maybe contributing buildings. What does it mean to be a contributing building in a downtown? We hear that a lot. Why do we want to keep a building? Or what buildings get torn down and what don't get torn down? A lot of times the criteria is they're contributing. What does that mean to you, say? Charissa, why don't you start with that one?
Well, I guess since I'm also an architectural historian, I actually write National Register nominations. Contributing building is just any building that's over 50 years old that still retains enough of its contributing features, and in my mind, that if the people who originally built it came back to life and looked at it, they would still recognize it. So if it's still recognizable as from its era, it's contributing. Now, I remember talking to a guy from the city and I've talked to a lot of clients who deal with the money, who feel like, well, we don't have enough money to rehab all the contributing buildings, so we need to pick and choose. And so in his mind, like the Lincoln Theater, a key building, that should be saved, but all that other stuff, that's trash, that can just be let go. And I'm like, no, it's the fabric, that's the neighborhood around the Lincoln Theater. But he controlled the money, so I didn't have this argument with him to his face. But yeah, I hear it a lot from many other people that we have limited resources and therefore we should just concentrate on the gems of our city and save those. But I think that you just end up with what I remember when I first came to Columbus in 1986, people asked me how it was, and I was like, it reminds me of a city in Europe after World War II. Like, it was bombed. There's a building and a big empty space and a building and another big empty space. Like a whole bunch of buildings are missing. Yeah. And very nice now that a lot of it's being infilled, but that was the idea I had. It was like, it looked like it had been bombed out, and then at 5 o'clock, it was vacant.
A lot of parking lots.
Yes.
So Becca, I would say, Charissa, you gave us a kind of a technical approach to what a contributing building is. Becca, do you have another approach that you would think of as being a significant building that should be looked at as something worth preserving?
Well, I mean, I'd like to riff off of that technical definition and your sort of placement of it in action, which I think was an apt observation of how the city has changed from the 80s to now, where there really was sort of focus on maybe a few critical buildings. We weren't sure what to do with the other. We had a lot of surface lots that sort of cropped up, right? And in terms of those contributing buildings, as you were mentioning, it's the connection of maybe these signature places and buildings and how that relates to the rest of the city. And when we're looking at a contributing building, to me, it's, again, that smaller scale that's really important as well. Was it a building that had significance because of the family that was there and what they did? Part of our holdings within the Endangered Properties Fund is the Naggy Shoe Repair Building. It was a touchstone for the community. It was a family that repaired everyone's shoes in the neighborhood, right? So everyone knew it. Everyone had a connection to the space. And so it's hard for individuals to come back onto Parsons and not see that there. And so a concerted effort was made to save this building. It might be humble. It's very much a vernacular building. It was built, not really by master craftsmen of any way, but it was built. But that's an example of a really good example, I think, of one that's contributing. It contributes to the overall history and culture that was there. So we have this need to make sure that we understand what are the histories and places of these spaces, and how do we ensure that there is continuity in terms of buildings that need to remain in place so that we have that there.
Okay. So, Landmarks, you mentioned earlier, has the most endangered sites that they do a list every year. Do you have a particular building that you have identified personally as being something that you would love to see saved and renovated into a new use of some sort? Brad, why don't you? I don't want to give away something you're looking at today, but because somebody else might just jump on it.
A long time ago, I used to keep my cards close to the vest, and I realized that, there's no one looking at them, so what's the matter? What's the matter? You know what I mean? Just set them on the table. So we partnered with the Columbus Partnership, and we purchased the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services building, which is right behind Rebecca on the picture there. And if you think about it, just because something's on the National Register doesn't mean that you can't demolish it. So when you're talking about something on the streetscape, someone that's not a buy and hold strategist or an adaptive reuse person would look at that and say, well, we're going to scrape this thing and build a high rise. Imagine what that would do to the layered depth of our riverfront. If we just built a big building, because the lot goes all the way visually to where the tall marble building is, and if you did that, you'd take up 20% of the visibility of the entire streetscape with a new build, and it would look fantastic. But we also have that across the river right now with all the great work being done on the peninsula. So when we looked at it, and we were lucky enough for them to call us to put together an adaptive reuse, we're going to go in front of the Downtown Commission here, I think later this month, and put our plan out, but we're really excited about it. But then again, on an adaptive reuse, it's more difficult from a State Historic Preservation Office perspective and National Park Service perspective, because we have, there's a difference of adaptive reuse in a museum. And, museums are having a tough time right now, but here's the thing, if we try to make everything a museum, then we're going to have a lot of failed businesses, So with these buildings, adaptive reuse is so critical. There are amenity things that you need. There are things that you need to modify to make them modern, to make them attractive to people, because there are some things with the context of a building that you have to maintain if it's historic. So this is going to be one that, we're going to push barriers a little bit. And I think it needs, to maintain the skyline, it's necessary. And we're going to ask for support from Landmarks, which they've always been fantastic, some of the larger architectural firms that do that kind of work. And we're going to see if we can, get the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office to allow us to do something that'll really improve the riverfront of Columbus.
Charissa?
Well, I live in Clintonville, and I remember seeing like a lot of the older homes on High Street. They get demolished, and this new 4-story kind of condo retail building pops up. And I saw one funeral home get demolished, and it was a beautiful building with that green tile roof. And my husband was like, well, why didn't you guys buy it? I was like, well, it was $750,000. It was a little much. But then we saw a little for sale sign for the little one-room schoolhouse that's just north of Graceland. So a friend and I we just rushed in and we just bought it because we were terrified that someone would just buy it and tear it down. So now I own a one-room historic schoolhouse. And it has gone to the dogs because literally a dog groomer had been in that building for 40 years. And she finally retired this year, so I think now we're actually going to start carefully demolishing things and, see to what extent do we want to bring it back to a one-room schoolhouse. And maybe move into it, who knows?
All right, now you.
All right. No, and, the endangered properties list, it's one that it's a list that we've compiled across our membership, community members. They've all given us input on those buildings. And it's just our joy to give that information back out to the community on what's high priority. I'm going to go a little bit off script, but it is a building that we're working with right now, and it's on Monroe. It is not currently on our list because it is actively being worked on, and we are helping with this property owner bring it back piece by piece with our own expertise. And it's incredibly difficult because as an individual property owner, Brad, you were talking a lot about how challenging it is for you to get capital funding. So this is just an individual whose family was touched by Vincent Walters, who was a notable jazz musician and had essentially a music academy running out of his home. Many generations of students, when we were doing workshops, came back to visit and say how much this place meant to them, that he was more than just a jazz musician, that taught them more than just piano, but how to be someone that had pride in their work and how to go for whatever goal they wanted, just through effort and sheer determination and commitment, that he used the piano to convey those values. And it's a building where, we're having to help deal with, there's been a few environmental complaints. We're getting it back up to code. We're trying to get utilities back on. But it's a wonderful building that, with just a lot of concerted effort and attention from the community, we can help save. But it is an tenuous position.
Okay, we're going to be moving to questions from our live stream and in-person audience in a few minutes. So if you have any questions, please make your way to the microphone now. If you're watching online, please type in your questions into the chat. And before we take those questions, we got one more for the panelists. So we need, I guess, younger high school, college level people to start moving into this field. So what advice or what would you tell them based on your experiences about moving into this area of preservation?
It's an easy path, I would say, to start. I think, you can start by remodeling houses and understanding, kind of, I would say dated means of construction. But in fact, all construction is dated. It just, things get bigger and more complicated, on the technical side with mechanicals. But I think that's a path for people to get into real estate investing, and then some people that want to have a little more creativity and try to, figure out how to grow. They can move on to apartments, move on to small business, merchant structures. But it's not, the tax credit world is really the only way that you can do these large-scale adaptive reuse. And it's an incredibly sophisticated system that they don't teach. So I think that perhaps that may be, something that a college could take on as a master's course or something, because, it's amazing how many professionals in Central Ohio work on, we call them one-trick ponies, but like they work on one program. They have no idea how to do the other. And then it would be nice to have more people that are generalists that understand it, because then you can use multiple programs to save the big stuff. And that's the only way to do it. That's the only way we did it. Is we were able to use multiple federal, state, and local programs. And I think, the education piece is probably something that has to happen before we can just get, take someone from high school through college into, large-scale adaptive reuse. It's just that there's so many hurdles. Incredible amount of luck is how I did it. And it's hard for me to envision without, someone teaching them at an early age these programs, how they could do it.
Charissa?
Well, we've had some high school interns come through, and one thing I've always been very glad that they all decided to do was take cursive handwriting as an elective. When did that become an elective? Because, right, you can't read old documents if you don't understand how to read cursive and write cursive. So, yeah, I guess I would tell any high school intern, if you're interested in doing historic buildings, you need to be able to read cursive handwriting.
I would never guess that one, so.
I've been lucky that, yes, I've always loved history and I love writing. So, yes, I'm doing a project in Zanesville, and the developer wants to do a historic tax credit project, but his building wasn't listed in the National Register, so I wrote it. And I was writing at the same time as a district nomination for everybody else in downtown Zanesville, but his building was kind of an outlier. So in 1 year, I wrote a district and a regular National Register nomination. But also that tax credit application, it's a lot of writing. So yeah, we did it for the Woodward Opera House, and it was like writing a 100-page report and then updating it every time there's a change. So yes, anyone getting into historic buildings, I would say, yeah, you kind of have to like to write as well as design. And yeah, you can't mind getting dirty, because a lot of these buildings have been vacant for years. They have no existing drawings. You're going to have to go in and measure them, and you're going to come out really grubby.
We're supposed to be encouraging people here.
But it's fun. It's fun, though. She's
All right,
really
Becca.
cool stuff.
It's,
No, I mean, I think to echo that a bit, it's a mixture of being a generalist or a specialist that is willing to get into the generalist pool, right? Even if you are going to just specialize in terms of maybe one technique within the trades to help with historic preservation, you're still going to have to sort of rise up and sort of know what is the financial situation, what are the codes that I need to make sure that I'm in compliance with, how do I report this out, how do I connect with maybe the state historic preservation to show the work, right? So there's all these sorts of levels. I really benefited personally from having a background within urban planning and architecture, and actually I had a formal degree in psychology too. And I think because really what you're doing is you're finding out why are these spaces important to people?
yeah.
And that is, it just kind of gives you a whole, multiple levels, these different kind of disciplines. I see individuals that have backgrounds in anthropology in this too, because it is why these places are important. They are artifacts of our values and our society and culture.
Excellent.
Brought back a college memory. I remember seeing my guidance counselor, and I wanted to take entomology because I really like insects, and he just looked at me and said, "You want to be an architect, take something about people." So out of defiance, I just took abnormal psychology and deviant behavior and got that out of the way.
But to riff on that, though, what's really funny is that now architecture is looking at structures that insects create, right? So you were on the right track.
It's true. All right, it is CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions. So we got Doug Buchanan with CMC in the back, curating questions today, live stream audience. Okay, so for you in person, please join Doug at the microphone. Yes, in back there, good. Okay, out of respect for others, please keep your questions brief and make sure there's a question mark at the end of what you asked. We're not into statements here. So Doug, first question, please.
David, thank you, and thank you to today's panelists. Eric Frixel asks, and I might paraphrase this a little bit because this could be a whole college course. He asks, what is the history of historic preservation? So maybe I'll focus that in just a bit and say, when you think about historic preservation and its history in Columbus, what were kind of the crystallizing moments? You know, when did Columbus realize, oh gosh, we really need to work harder and collectively to save some of these fantastic structures?
I think, yeah.
No, well, I mean, yes. I think the real catalyst was with the Union Station in 1977. And really, it's not that buildings had not, with historic significance, had not already been knocked down at that point. But you had Daniel Burnham's structure. You had a court order not to proceed with the demolition. And you had actually what were the founders of Columbus Landmarks as interns and junior members starting their careers within the city, being the runners and running up documentation for a midnight judge to halt, right, and to save the last arch. And I think within the city of Columbus, we have that immediate history of what preservation is. From a national standpoint, we see different iterations of historic preservation being important. Actually, at the founding of our country as well, concerns that we had founding fathers' homes that needed to be preserved and what that should look like. One of the first programs is actually at Columbia University with their architecture program and preservation. So, and different iterations have occurred across preservation and different focuses. And so you can look to Cornell for sustainability and historic preservation. That was the grounding of their root and program. Columbia was really sort of more of that cultural concern with alongside architecture. And so within historic preservation, there is a whole continuum of what priorities need to be and should be. Then they've occurred across our own history. And so it's a great question.
Yeah, and on the federal nationwide level, in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, and that meant that any project that had any federal funding or permitting or any federal requirements had to take into account cultural resources, which included historic buildings, historic places, archaeology sites. So a lot of the agencies like ODOT that get a lot of federal highway money, before they widen any road or build a new road, they have to do an archaeology survey and make sure they're not going to impact any historic archaeology sites or buildings by their projects.
Thank you. My name's Brent Foley. I'm with Triad Architects. Charissa, it's good to see you outside of a GVC commission meeting. You guys didn't mention that GVC, Urban Village Commission, was obviously one of the early starters in historic preservation. This is my first CMC since the pandemic, so it's good to see people in person. This is a nice thing again. But my question has to go around the tax credits. First, all the panelists spoke of the tax credits, and Brad, you spoke specifically of the difficulty in scoring in different districts. In our experience, there's also difficulty in scoring in sizes of projects. Those large projects and small projects tend to be less competitive, and they tend to be easier to get the funding, and those middle-sized projects tend to not be able to get, or be a lot more competitive and not get the projects. What can we be doing as architects, developers, different people to advocate to the state to increase the funding? We all hear rumors of that happening, take the budget lift off and those types of things, and try to make these buildings get saved.
So I think for the small pool projects, which is construction costs, qualified construction costs less than $1 million, could get up to $250,000 in a state tax credit. I think that organically is going to keep occurring. I think architects can continue to educate people if their building qualifies, if they're in a historic district, what can be done to obtain those credits. When you get in the mid pool and the big pool and you have these larger projects, I mean, I've had developers that are, very intelligent people come in and, okay, what now? Like how do I take this tax credit and how does it turn into money? And it's complicated. It's incredibly complicated. It's a market that shifts and moves, and you're negotiating with typically national groups. So I don't know from an architectural standpoint. Maybe referring them to a really good tax attorney. I think that's a good one, and a great accounting firm. I think those are great avenues to be able to direct. But I think the bigger thing is some of the best developers we have in Central Ohio won't touch tax credit deals, and it's just because they want to move faster. And like we have this whole thing with adaptive reuse right now that's a major problem, where we're trying to hold dinosaurs to be dinosaurs, and we need to get them to run like cheetahs. You know what I mean? And it's hard. And like we need to really be able to focus in, and we need everybody to focus in that, hey, if we're doing an adaptive reuse and we can maintain historic fabric on a building, you can still get tax credits. We're gonna push the National Park Service. We're not just gonna take what they're gonna say and try to reiterate how they're gonna interpret it. State employees at SHPO work for the state. They work for Ohio. The funding comes from Ohio. Represent Ohio development, and that's what I think will get some of the big boys, and females into the space. And I think, if we can do that and we get our big developers willing to incorporate historic structures into their development, I think we're going to see a lot more big projects happen. We're going to see a lot more historic fabric, live on.
Well, and for those small projects, I would say if you have a very small project, even if it's only like $250,000 and tax credits are just a little bit of it, just submit it. Because I remember working on a project, I did it for pro bono, but I was amazed that the project got approved for tax credit, because in my opinion, the guy who submitted it just didn't do a very good job with the application form. But I think the project was so small that by the time the state awarded everything, there was still this little bit of money left. So I think they just look and say, all right, who else is left that's minimally qualified that we can just award it to and not have any leftover money. And I swear that's just me thinking. Because I worked on the document, and I'm just like, oh, I don't know. But, he got it, so there's a way.
Thank you. Gretchen Hummel asks, what do you think about the Columbus Historical Society's plans for Engine House 6 and the Harrison House, which I believe is in Franklinton?
I don't know much.
I saw the RFP for it, and what they proposed to do to it seems really cool. I mean, that's another building that I've driven down Broad Street and go, oh, that is a really cool building. That would make a cool office. And apparently that's what they want to do, is renovate it into like a museum in the front with like a community meeting room, and in the future, offices on the second floor. So if they actually get the funding and pull this off, I think it'll be a very nice building. And one thing I would be curious to see is how they deal with that old tower, if they're going to keep it open, or is it going to have to be closed up?
So I remember that building. So I think it was Ray's Vacuum Service that was in there, if I remember correct. So I think they brought it to us to purchase, and we looked at it. And then Heritage Ohio was looking at it, and they had a plan, and they had some great members on their board that then brought a plan to us, and we looked at it. But the issue is one of those things that didn't have enough square feet. And that's the hard thing, is you get some of these buildings with a lot of integrity on the front, and then they're just shallow, or the lot doesn't allow you to incorporate, enough parking to be sufficient. So I hope it works. I hope they get it through. I mean, that is something to where I think that's the only way to solve that building, because it'd be very difficult to find another use for it, just because of, the size and the amount of money that you would have to put into it.
Thanks for being here. I'm Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club. Over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, the city has been talking about revamping and revising much-needed Columbus building code. I don't know how informed all of you are, but do we know if there's any progress being made on that? And if so, if not, how is that impacting, how is that affecting some of the historic preservation that's trying to get done in Columbus?
I mean, my understanding is that the city's hiring an outside consultant to help with this, and we're waiting on that consultant. At least that's what I had heard.
Well, the state has done a pretty good job with their Chapter 34 existing buildings, that if you have an existing building and you want to rehab it, there's an alternative method to meet the code without actually putting in sprinklers and all these expensive things that some clients can't afford. So I worked on a B&O railroad station up in Mount Vernon, and we got them to a certain point, and then they told us, okay, we got it from here, don't worry about it. And so I didn't. So 2 years later, I get the frantic call, well, we're opening this year, and we got this pink notice from the state. And I was like, oh, crap, they never got a permit. So literally, we did that code calculation and submitted it, where they didn't have to put in certain things, but they could substitute less expensive items. That would be okay. And we got them moved in, and they had their 100th anniversary of the founding of the railroad station open house. So yeah, so the state seemed to have gotten a way to rehab buildings, so I hope the city will kind of look to that as a model.
Okay, since I'm Warren Fishman, since I'm the last person, I'll make this really quick. Always been interested in, once you accept the credits and you get the building finished and it's an historical building, what are the limitations of that building as the years go by? 10 years down the road, if somebody wants to update it or change it, what kind of limitations are there?
So there's something called a conservation easement, and if you donate it, that's in perpetuity. There's a lot of thoughts on the legal definition of perpetuity. Is that actually forever? I'm not in those discussions, but that's an easement. The tax credits is a five-year hold from after you place it in service. So traditionally, you can't sell a controlling interest in the property. So you can only sell up to a third, and most people want to play it safe, and you can only sell up to 25% of a property within 5 years. So you essentially can't sell it for 5 years, and then you have to maintain all of the parts that are in what they call your Part 2 when you did the construction, and then the Part 3 is the final approval. 5 years from that date is if you make any changes to it, and they catch you, then they could come back and recapture. So it's a huge penalty. But after 5 years, you can, with tax credits, you can do whatever you want. So it is something that does really kind of give you the gasoline to get it going, get it adapted, but it doesn't control the real estate forever. Now, Columbus has a historic registry that, if you put it on there, it's like an easement. It binds it forever. So those are some of the nuances that where it's, you really need to get an attorney or someone that's done it before to really guide you through some of these projects, because you can go a wrong path really quick and give up a lot of value.
And you need to have really good property insurance, because if your building burns down in those 5 years, the IRS will want their money back.
All right. Wish we had more time, but that's it for today. We're going to bring up Kristen again for the concluding remarks, and thank you.
Well, I hope everyone found today's forum as inspiring as I did. One thing that I'm going to take away is, Columbus has had such an interesting and bold past. And I think with the experts up here and many of you in the room who are so passionate about our history, I think that we're going to see many of these buildings in the future as well. So thank you for all your work in this important space. I'd like to thank also the Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Fund and our today's sponsor, Moody Nolan. Thank you so much. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation, and for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And of course, for our speakers today, Brad DeHays, Charissa Durst, Rebecca Kemper, and our host, David Meleca, thank you so much. Please make plans to join us next Wednesday for Ohio's Electric Future, AEP's Perspective, and that'll feature AEP executives Nick Akins and Sandy Nessing, along with our moderator, Andy Chow. Thank you all for joining us. We could not do this without you, and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Thank you.